What if the ground opened for you long before your final breath left your body? What if the soil knew your name before your soul ever crossed to the other side? This is not just a tale of death, it's a curse that follows bloodlines. A legacy carved in tombstones buried deep across 7 generations. In a village long forgotten by maps but remembered by shadows, an unspeakable pact was made. And from that moment on, the firstborns of one cursed lineage have heard the whispers of the grave before they ever died. This story unravels the horrifying truth of a name passed down through centuries, where each generation inches closer to a fate already dug in the earth, waiting. This is his grave was dug before he ever died. But here's the real question. If death were promised to you before you lived, would you dare be born? Drop your thoughts in the comments. What would you do if you knew your ending had already begun? Make sure to like, subscribe, and share this spine-chilling saga with fellow horror lovers. You don't want to miss how this dark legacy unfolds across 7 generations, each one more twisted than the last. The wind screamed through the trees like a soul clawing to stay in the world of the living. A heavy fog curled over the roots of the forest, cloaking Roran Vale in a suffocating blanket of white. The village itself, older than memory, stood crooked and hunched like it was trying to hide from the eyes of heaven. And in the dead center of it all was a boy named Emmerich Vera, born with a veil over his face, what midwives called a death cowl. Emmerich was pulled into the world screaming louder than any babe before him. His mother bled out moments later, whispering words none could understand except the old crone who served as midwife. The crone, shivering and wide-eyed, dropped the blood-soaked baby and staggered out of the room, muttering the same phrase over and over. His grave is dug, his grave is already dug. No one had time to ponder it. Life in Roran Vale was brutal. Survival rarer than peace. Emmerich's father, a stoic hunter named Tavern, buried his wife that evening. He didn't weep. He didn't speak. But the way his eyes kept darting to the forest and how his hands trembled around the shovel told the villagers something was wrong. Something had returned. Years passed, but the shadow clung to Emmerich like a second skin. Animals snarled when he walked near. His blood boiled if he neared the churchyard. And at night he heard digging. Always digging. Not from outside his window, but from beneath his. At 15, Emmerich had nightmares so vivid they stained his sheets in sweat and left claw marks across his arms. He dreamed of roots strangling his throat, of worms crawling from his eyes, of standing knee-deep in a pit while faceless figures watched from above. In every dream a single gravestone stood behind him, chipped, moss-covered, bearing only one word, Vero. The village priest, Father Orlan, called these dreams whispers of the grave. He insisted Emmerich be cleansed, even exorcised, but each attempt left the boy worse. His eyes rolled white, his voice deepened, echoing with words he had never learned. Once during a cleansing, he broke every candle in the church without ever lifting a hand. It was then that Father Orlan locked the church and left town under the cover of night. By 17, Emmerich had come to accept he was haunted. But it wasn't until the festival of Barren Moon that horror truly took root. Each year the villagers celebrated the night where the moon vanished, symbolizing the death of the past and birth of new hope. But this year, when the moon disappeared, something else emerged. It started with the smell, foul, wet, earthy rot. Then came the sound, shovels dragging through dirt, but no one was digging. The ground in the village square shook. Graves long forgotten erupted. Bones danced in the moonless dark, wailing in pain. The villagers screamed and scattered, but Emmerich stood still, eyes wide, locked on a figure climbing from the earth. It was his mother, or rather what was left of her. Hollow sockets, flesh eaten by worms, arms outstretched. You were born in death, my son, and death calls you home. Emmerich fainted. When he awoke, he was alone. Not just in the square, but in the entire village. Every house was empty, every door hung open. Not a drop of blood, No bodies, just silence and fog. He wandered the streets for days, shouting, pleading, but Roran Vale had become a ghost town. Food rotted on tables. Chairs sat askew. The fog never lifted. And then, the dreams changed. Now he saw 7 graves, each with a name he didn't recognize but a face he somehow knew. People who hadn't been born yet. Children, adults, old men. He saw them all suffer. Torn apart, buried alive, hunted by shadows with twisted faces. In each dream, one phrase echoed like a funeral bell. His grave was dug before he ever died. On the 7th day of solitude, Emmerich ventured into the forest, chasing the sound of that voice. He came to a clearing he'd never seen before, where a stone mausoleum sat like a tumor on the earth. No door, no window, just a single carved message over its entrance. Vero blood returns to earth. With a strange certainty, Emmerich pressed his hand to the stone, and it opened with a moan like the world sighing in pain. Inside, a spiral staircase led down into blackness. He lit a torch and descended. What he found was not a tomb. It was a library, a grotesque archive, carved into the earth itself, filled with books bound in flayed skin, inked in blood. Paintings lined the walls, each one depicting death, horror, prophecy. And in the center, a pedestal holding a single open journal, its last line fresh and dripping. Generation 1, the boy who walked with the grave. Emmerich took the book. As he did, the walls began to shake. Dust rained from above. The door slammed shut. Something was coming down the stairs. He turned to run, but the journal screamed in his hands. Pages flipped on their own, blood pouring from the spine. A voice roared through the chamber, deep, ancient, and filled with joy. The first has awakened. Let the gravekeeper rise. The lights died. The screams began. Emmerich never left that place again, but his blood did. The fog lingered around the edges of the village of Roran Vale for weeks after Emmerich Vero disappeared, as though the earth itself refused to let go of the horror that had erupted from its bowels. The people whispered, not daring to speak the truth aloud, but there were none left to speak it anyway. The village was abandoned, the soil soaked with secrets and dread. But as with all curses, it doesn't end with one generation. A shadow only grows stronger when left unchallenged. And it wasn't long before the curse found its way to the next Darvin Vero, Emmerich's unborn great-nephew. It was his birth, on a stormy night in the year following Emmerich's disappearance, that would mark the second chapter of the Vero family's terrifying destiny. Unlike Emmerich, Darvin's entrance into the world was quiet. His mother, a woman named Ava, gave birth to him alone, surrounded by the thick, suffocating fog that still hung heavy over Roran Vale. The village was no longer a place for the living, but the dead had left behind something, a lingering, unseen presence. Ava could feel it, that ominous weight in her chest, as if her son had been born not just into the world, but into a promise made long ago. Darvin was an odd child with unsettling gray eyes that seemed to see through walls, to peer beyond what was visible. From the moment he could walk, the other children in the village grew terrified of him. They whispered behind his back about his strange behavior, his unblinking stares, and the way he often muttered things in the middle of the night, things no child should know. Ava, consumed by her own grief over Emmerich's vanishing and the eerie silence that clung to their land, tried to comfort her son, but it wasn't long before she too began to feel it, the pull of something dark, a sense that no matter how far they ran, the grave would follow them. One evening, as Darvin was playing in the woods near the remnants of the church, he stumbled upon something that shouldn't have existed. It was a grave, but it wasn't like any grave he had ever seen before. It was freshly dug, the soil still loose and unsettlingly warm, as though it had only been opened moments ago. Darvin knelt by the grave, his small hands trembling as he brushed aside the dirt. The name carved into the stone was too familiar. Emmerich Vero. The wind howled through the trees, and the faintest whisper brushed Darvin's ears. He heard the voice, soft and insistent, calling to him from the earth below. It's time. The gravekeeper is waiting. Chilled to the bone, Darvin stumbled back, his heart raced. But before he could move further, something caught his eye. A figure in the distance. At first he thought it was a trick of the light, or perhaps his imagination playing tricks on him. But the figure grew clearer with each passing second. A tall, gaunt man, with hollow eyes, his clothes tattered and caked with dirt. The man's lips stretched into a grotesque smile, his voice a raspy whisper. You should not have come here, Darvin. Your bloodline cannot escape. Before Darvin could respond, the man vanished into the fog, leaving only the sound of his breath in the air. Panic surged in Darvin's chest as the fog began to thicken, swirling around him like an inescapable trap. The next few weeks passed in a blur of fear and confusion. Darvin's nightmares worsened. He would wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, hearing the sound of footsteps outside his window, slow, deliberate steps that seemed to be pacing in a circle. Each time he dared to look outside, there would be nothing but the cold, misty night, and yet the feeling of being watched would never leave him. It was on the night of his 16th birthday, while he sat alone by the fire, that Darvin felt the full weight of the curse pressing down upon him. The house groaned with the force of something unseen, and the flames flickered as though fighting against an invisible force. And then, the door creaked open. Ava entered the room, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror. Darvin, she whispered, her voice trembling, you need to leave. They're coming. They've already come for you. Darvin's heart sank. He had known for years that something was wrong, but to hear his mother finally admit it made the air seem to constrict around him. Ava didn't speak again but turned and ran towards the forest. Darvin followed without thinking, knowing deep down that it was too late. Whatever this was, it had already begun. They ran through the misty woods, the ancient trees bending under the weight of something unseen. The ground beneath them felt wrong, soft, as if it were swallowing them whole. Ava's breath came in ragged gasps as she stumbled through the thickening fog, her hand gripping Darvin's tightly. As they neared the clearing where the old church once stood, the ground trembled. Darvin could feel it, something ancient stirring beneath the earth, something that was awakening. Suddenly the fog parted, and the mausoleum from his dreams appeared in the distance, looming like a dark sentinel. Ava stopped abruptly, her face pale with terror. This is where it began, she said, her voice barely a whisper. And this is where the gravekeeper, he will take you as he took your uncle. Darvin's heart thudded in his chest. Who is the gravekeeper? What is this curse? Ava's eyes met his, filled with fear and resignation. The gravekeeper is not just a man, not just a creature. He is the spirit of death that has followed our bloodline. His grave was dug before he ever died, and now it's your turn to take his place. Before Darvin could protest, a chilling sound pierced the air, the unmistakable scraping of a shovel digging into earth. It echoed from the forest behind them, and then the ground shifted. A figure rose from the earth, tall, skeletal, and wrapped in tattered robes. His hollow eyes locked onto Darvin, and the air grew cold with the weight of death. The gravekeeper had come. Ava stepped forward, her face a mask of sorrow. I'm sorry, Darvin, but you cannot escape. With that, the gravekeeper raised his bony hand and pointed at Darvin. The ground beneath Darvin's feet began to crack and split open. The earth was claiming him, as it had claimed his ancestors before him. But Darvin was no longer afraid. He had inherited the curse just as Emmerich had, just as his bloodline always would. And now, the gravekeeper would make him his successor. The village of Roran Vale had been forgotten by all but the shadows that now walked its empty streets. The fog, thick as blood, had settled deeper into the earth, and the trees had grown twisted and gnarled, their limbs reaching out like skeletal fingers. There were no more children to play in the meadows, no more laughter to break the silence. Only whispers remained. The story of Darvin Vale, the boy who was claimed by the gravekeeper, was passed down through fragmented stories. Some said he had vanished without a trace. Others whispered of a terrible pact made between the cursed bloodline and the creature that haunted the village. But no one could say for certain. The curse had not ended with Darwin. It continued traveling with the wind, coursing through the veins of the next generation. Mira Vero, the great-granddaughter of Darwin, born under the weight of the same darkness. Mira was born far from Roran Vale in a city called Ilindra, where the sun shone brighter and the air tasted sweeter. But no place is truly safe when blood calls to blood. Mira's parents, Alistair and Isolde Vero, had fled the cursed village years ago, hoping to leave behind the legacy of death and despair. They raised their daughter in peace, unaware that the curse was far from finished. From an early age, Mira showed an unsettling sensitivity to the world around her. She could feel the shift of the seasons before they happened. She could hear voices in the wind when no one else could. At night she would wake, heart racing, drenched in sweat, hearing faint scraping sounds beneath her bed, as if something or someone was trying to crawl out. The nightmare started when she turned 11. She would wake screaming, her eyes wide with terror, but never able to remember the details. The one thing she could recall with perfect clarity was the feeling, the suffocating, creeping sense that she was being watched. It was during the fall of her 16th year that Mira experienced the first manifestation of the curse that had followed her family for centuries. She had been walking home alone through a forest path when a strange fog rolled in, obscuring the way ahead. It was thick, choking, and it clung to her skin like the hands of the dead. The trees, once full of life, now appeared twisted and hunched, as though they were trying to hide from something lurking in the shadows. As she pressed on, the feeling of being watched grew unbearable. She turned a corner, only to freeze in her tracks. There, standing at the edge of the path, was a figure tall, dressed in tattered robes, his face obscured by a dark hood. His eyes, black as coal, gleamed from the depths of the shadows, and in his hand he held a shovel. Mira's heart pounded in her chest. The figure did not speak, but she felt it. She felt his presence, as though he had always been there waiting for her. He raised the shovel slowly, deliberately, as if marking the moment she would join him. His lips parted, and in a voice that reverberated with the weight of centuries, he spoke. "The blood of the Veros calls to the earth. Your grave was dug before you ever lived." The words hit Mira like a physical blow. She could not breathe. She could not move. Her eyes locked onto the figure, and everything around her seemed to fall away. The fog, the forest, the path, all of it melted into the void. All that existed was the gravekeeper, the creature that had haunted her bloodline since its cursed inception. "You cannot escape the past," the figure whispered, taking a step closer. "The grave is waiting. It is always waiting." Before Mira could react, a gust of wind slammed into her, knocking her off her feet. She fell to the ground, but when she looked up, the figure was gone. The fog had lifted, and the world around her was silent once again. The oppressive weight of fear still clung to her, but she was alone. Shaking, Mira stood and stumbled back home, her mind racing. Who was this figure? Why had he appeared to her? What did it all mean? That night, she could not sleep. The words echoed in her mind, replaying over and over. Your grave was dug before you ever lived. Mira had heard stories, old rumors of a curse, of a family bound to an ancient evil, but those had always been tales to scare children. They were stories her parents had long since dismissed as superstition. Yet, as she lay awake, she realized with chilling clarity that the stories were true. The curse was real. The next morning, Mira confronted her parents. She could see the hesitation in their eyes, the way they glanced away, unwilling to meet her gaze. They had known, all along, they had never been able to escape the past. It had followed them. It had followed her. "I saw him," Mira whispered, her voice trembling. "The gravekeeper, he was real. He said my grave was already dug." Her parents exchanged a look. A silent communication passed between them. Isolde, her mother, sighed heavily and sat down beside her. "Mira, there are things we should have told you long ago, but we hoped you would never have to know." Alistair, her father, nodded solemnly. "The curse, It's bound to our bloodline. Every firstborn child of the Vale family is marked. It's not something we can escape. Emmerich, your great-great-grandfather, he was the first, and now the curse has come for you. Mira's blood ran cold. She had always wondered why she felt different, why the weight of the world seemed to rest on her shoulders. But this was more than she could ever have imagined. What does it want from me? She asked, her voice barely a whisper, her mother's eyes filled with sorrow. It wants your soul, Mira. It wants you to join the others, the ones who have been claimed by the gravekeeper. It's a cycle, and you are the next in line. Mira recoiled, her mind racing. She couldn't be the next to die. She couldn't, but her father's voice cut through the terror that gripped her heart. There is no escaping it. We can only delay it for so long. We tried, but it always comes for the firstborn. You were born into this fate, and nothing can change it. Mira sat in stunned silence. The weight of her family's curse crushed her chest. How could she fight something so ancient, so bound to her blood? How could she break free? But deep within, a spark of defiance flickered. If she couldn't escape the curse, maybe she could face it head on. Maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to fight back. But first, she had to learn the truth. And to do that, she would have to return to Roran. The decision to return to Roran Vale was not one Mira made lightly. After all, the cursed village had been abandoned for generations, its very name whispered only in hushed tones. But the words of her parents had left her no choice. There was no escaping her fate, no running from the gravekeeper, no denying that the legacy of the Vale family was a chain that had shackled her from birth. Mira packed her belongings in the dead of night, not telling her parents, not wanting to worry them further. She knew they were afraid for her, afraid of the very thing that had come for them and their ancestors. But Mira, despite the terror gnawing at her insides, felt a strange sense of purpose. The curse had come for her, but she wouldn't go quietly. She would find a way to fight it. At dawn, she set out, heading toward the desolate village, armed only with the knowledge her parents had reluctantly shared. They had warned her of the gravekeeper, of Emmerich's fate, of the shadows that walked in the fog, but they hadn't given her the full story because they didn't know it. The true origins of the curse had been lost in time, buried along with the remnants of the village itself. Mira journeyed alone, determined to uncover the truth that had haunted her family for centuries. As the miles passed beneath her boots, the land around her seemed to grow darker, colder. The air grew heavy with a suffocating weight that only worsened as she approached the outskirts of Roran Vale. The wind whispered through the trees, a low, mournful hum that made her skin crawl. When she reached the edge of the village, it felt as though the earth itself had sighed in relief. The fog that had clung to the land for so long parted, revealing the decaying remnants of the village. The once vibrant houses were now little more than skeletal remains, their walls broken and windows shattered. The church, which had once been a beacon of hope, was now nothing more than a hollow shell. Mira felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. She wasn't alone. She never had been. The fog, the village, the land, it all seemed to be watching her, waiting for her next move. With a deep breath, she stepped into the village. The silence was deafening. Not a single bird called out. Not a single wind stirred the leaves. Only the whispers of the gravekeeper filled the air, faint but unmistakable. It is time. It is time. Mira gritted her teeth and pressed on. She had come for answers, and she would find them no matter the cost. She made her way to the center of the village, where the church once stood. The ruins were now a monument to something much darker, something ancient and far more powerful than anything Mira could have imagined. As she entered the church, she felt the temperature drop. Her breath came out in visible clouds as she stepped over the threshold, the weight of centuries pressing down upon her. The floor was covered in a thick layer of dust, and the pews were broken, scattered like fallen soldiers. And then she saw it. At the far end of the church, a large stone altar stood, its surface covered in strange arcane symbols. Mira approached cautiously, feeling an invisible force tug at her, pulling her closer to the altar. The whispers grew louder, clearer. "You have come to face me, child of the Varo blood, but you are too late." The voice was low, ancient and filled with an unnerving sense of finality. Mira's heart pounded in her chest, but she refused to turn away. She stepped forward, placing a hand on the altar. The ground beneath her feet trembled. The walls of the church groaned with the weight of something massive moving below. Mira's eyes widened in horror as she realized that the altar was not just a relic. It was a doorway, a gateway to something older than time itself. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from the very stone beneath her feet. Her heart raced as she understood what was happening. The curse was not just tied to her family. It was tied to this very land, to the village itself, to the earth beneath her. Suddenly the air grew thick with an overwhelming presence. Mira felt the temperature drop even further, until her breath came out in frosty puffs. She turned to see a figure emerging from the shadows. It was the gravekeeper, but he was no longer the gaunt, skeletal figure she had seen before. He was something more terrible. His eyes burned with an unnatural light, and his body seemed to writhe as though it were made of shifting shadows. "You should not have come here, child," the gravekeeper intoned, his voice echoing in the empty church. "You cannot escape your fate. The blood of the Varos is mine to claim. It has always been mine." Mira took a step back, her mind racing. She knew this was the moment where the curse would claim her just as it had claimed her ancestors. But she refused to succumb. She clenched her fists and lifted her chin, staring the gravekeeper down. "What are you?" she demanded, her voice shaking but determined. "What do you want from me?" The gravekeeper's lips twisted into a grotesque smile. "I am the keeper of the grave, the one who ensures that death's claim is honored. The curse that follows your bloodline was not born of choice. It was born of necessity. The earth requires balance. The blood of the Varos is its price." Mira's mind raced, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't just accept it. She couldn't let it end like this. There had to be another way. There had to be something she could do. "You said the blood is your price," Mira said, a new resolve building inside her. "Then I'll make a deal. I'll give you my blood, but only if you tell me the truth. Only if you tell me what I need to know to stop this curse from consuming my family." The gravekeeper tilted his head, intrigued by her boldness. "The truth? What makes you think you can handle the truth, child of Varo?" Mira took a deep breath. She had come too far to back down now. "I'll handle whatever it takes. I'll do what it takes to end this." The gravekeeper's gaze darkened. For a long moment there was silence. Then, with a voice that seemed to ripple through the very air, he spoke. "Very well, the truth is this. The curse cannot be broken. It was never meant to be broken, but perhaps you can choose to wield it. You can choose to become the gravekeeper yourself." Mira's blood ran cold as the meaning of his words sank in. The curse was not just a punishment. It was a responsibility, a legacy that had been passed down through generations, one that she could either reject or embrace. The choice was hers. Mira stood frozen in the ancient church, the cold air pressing in from all sides, as the gravekeeper's words echoed in her ears. Her pulse raced, her mind whirling with the weight of his offer. "You can choose to become the gravekeeper yourself." The words reverberated through her, chilling her to the bone. What did it mean to wield the curse? What price would she have to pay? And could she even choose to embrace something so terrible, so monstrous? The gravekeeper's form flickered in the shadows, his eyes burning with an eerie, otherworldly light. He seemed to grow taller, his presence suffocating, as though the very air around them had thickened with ancient power. "I am the keeper of the grave," he said again, his voice slow and deliberate. "I have existed for as long as the curse itself, and now the time has come for you to decide. You can walk away. as your ancestors did. Or you can choose to take my place. Mira's mind raced. There was no escaping the curse. No running from it. The gravekeeper was right about that. Every firstborn Varro had been bound to the same fate, each one drawn to this cursed village, to the altar where the gravekeeper waited. But Mira had learned something important during her journey here. She had power. She had strength. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way to take control of this fate, to defy the very thing that had been written for her bloodline. What happens if I choose to become the gravekeeper? Mira asked, her voice trembling but determined. Her fingers gripped the edges of the altar, and she could feel the pulse of energy thrumming beneath her palms, as though the stone itself were alive. The gravekeeper's smile twisted further, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. You will take my place, child. You will become the keeper of the graves, the guardian of the curse. You will be bound to this land, just as I am. You will have the power to decide who lives, who dies. You will be the one to ensure that the balance is maintained. Mira's heart thudded in her chest. Power. It was so tempting, so alluring. She could end the curse. She could stop the endless cycle of suffering that had plagued her family. But at what cost? To become the gravekeeper was to embrace death itself. To become a servant of something ancient, something far beyond her understanding. No, she whispered, shaking her head. I won't become you. I won't be trapped in this endless cycle. The gravekeeper's eyes flickered with something like amusement. You misunderstand, child. The cycle is not something you can simply break. It is part of you. You were born into it, and you cannot escape what you are. Mira took a step back, her mind spinning. She needed time to think. The weight of his offer was suffocating, but she refused to be his puppet. There had to be another way. She had come this far, defied the gravekeeper's influence in the very heart of the cursed village. There had to be a way to break the chain. Just as she turned to leave, the ground beneath her feet trembled. The air grew thick with the sound of shuffling, distant whispers, and the unmistakable rustle of movement in the shadows. Mira's heart skipped a beat as she turned back toward the altar. The fog. It had returned. The gravekeeper's laughter filled the church, dark and twisted, as the fog closed in around her like a suffocating blanket. She could see nothing now, only the swirling mist that thickened by the second, wrapping around her, making it hard to breathe. Mira's pulse quickened. She couldn't let it take her. She couldn't let herself be consumed by the fog, by the curse. She had to find a way out, and fast. As the fog grew denser, she heard a voice in the distance, calling her name. Mira, Mira. Her heart lurched. It wasn't the gravekeeper's voice. This voice, it was familiar. Mira, it's me. She turned, her breath catching in her throat. There, standing in the doorway of the church, was Alistair, her father. But something was wrong. His face was pale, his eyes hollow and glazed. He looked as though he hadn't aged a day, yet the very air around him felt wrong, unnatural. Father? Mira's voice was a hoarse whisper, unsure whether this was some cruel trick of the fog, or if her father had truly come to save her. Mira, you need to listen to me, Alistair said, his voice calm but urgent. You've made a terrible mistake. The curse is not something you can fight. It's not something you can change. It is a part of who we are. You can't escape it. You can't break it. Mira stepped forward, confusion and fear welling up inside her. But I can't just accept it. I can't let the curse consume me like it did to Emmerich and Darwin. There has to be another way. Her father's face twisted, as though in pain. There is no other way, Mira. You don't understand. If you choose to fight it, you will only end up like us. You will be bound to the earth, to the fog. The curse will consume your soul. The fog pressed in on her, wrapping around her, making it hard to see. Her father's figure seemed to blur, becoming indistinct as the mist thickened. Mira's heart raced. "No, I won't become like you," she shouted. But the words were drowned out by the rising whispers, the cries of those lost to the curse. They were all around her now, clawing at the edges of her mind, pulling her deeper into the fog. "You will become like me," Alistair's voice echoed, now distant and hollow. "It's your fate. It always has been." In that moment, Mira realized the terrible truth. The curse was not just an external force. It was a part of her. It was written into her very being, embedded in her soul. Her bloodline had been marked long before she was born, and there was no running from it. But Mira was not about to give in. She would not let the curse define her. There had to be a way to gain control, to wield this power without being consumed by it. She clenched her fists, her determination burning bright. "I won't let this be my end," she whispered to herself, the words a vow. With one final glance at her father's fading figure, she turned toward the altar, where the gravekeeper still watched her with those cold, burning eyes. The fog was thick, but Mira could feel something stirring within her, something ancient and powerful. It was her choice now. She could either accept the curse and become what they wanted her to be, or she could fight for control and carve her own path. The gravekeeper's voice echoed through the mist, as if sensing her defiance. "You cannot fight fate, child. You cannot escape me." But Mira's resolve only hardened. "I'll make my own." Mira stood alone in the heart of the forsaken church, her breath shallow and rapid, the fog swirling thick around her. The gravekeeper's words hung in the air, like an insidious chant. "You cannot cake me. You cannot fight fate." But as Mira tightened her grip on the stone altar, a fire burned deep within her, fierce, unyielding. She refused to be a puppet to some ancient curse. The fog thickened further, the whispers around her intensified. Her father's fading image, his voice now reduced to a hollow echo, was swallowed by the mist. She felt it creeping into her skin, cold and oppressive, as if the very earth beneath her feet was reaching up to claim her. The shadows of those who had come before her, Emmerich, Darwin, her own ancestors, seemed to close in around her. But Mira had already made her choice. There was no going back. She focused all her energy into the altar, pushing her hands against it, as if trying to force the answers from the very stone. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of lost souls, desperate and pleading. They wanted release, just as she did. She could feel their collective sorrow, their torment stretching across centuries. They were bound by the same curse that had held her family in its grip. The ground trembled beneath her feet, and then the altar began to crack. Mira gasped, her hands flying back instinctively as the stone split, deep fissures running through its surface. She could hear something stirring inside the altar, something ancient, something powerful. It was as if the very earth was alive, responding to her touch, responding to her will. The fog around her thickened, swirling, pulling her closer to the center of the room. The gravekeeper's voice boomed from the shadows. "You seek power, child. You seek to control that which is beyond your understanding." Mira stood tall, her gaze unflinching. "I seek to understand," she responded fiercely, "and I seek to break free." The fog began to coalesce, swirling violently around her, as the very air crackled with energy. Mira's pulse quickened, her blood rushing in her veins, As something inside the altar stirred even more violently, the whispers rose to a maddening crescendo, now a chorus of angry, agonized voices. And then, there was a violent crack. The altar shattered, breaking open like a tomb, and a flood of blackened energy surged forth, engulfing Mira in an instant. The darkness roared around her, deafening and suffocating, as if the very universe had come alive to swallow her. For a moment, everything went still. Mira could feel the earth beneath her feet, the cold touch of the fog against her skin. But she was no longer in control. It was as if her body had been taken from her, as if her soul was being ripped apart by an invisible force. Then in the overwhelming darkness, a presence took shape. A figure stepped out of the fog, a tall shadowed silhouette. Its features were obscured, but Mira could feel its power, its ancient presence, and it was him, the Gravekeeper. But he was no longer a simple skeletal figure with hollow eyes. No, this being was something far older, something far darker. The figure radiated power, an aura so thick and suffocating that Mira felt herself drowning in its weight. She could sense the malevolent intelligence behind the being's presence. It was the curse, alive and aware. "You have no idea what you are meddling with," the Gravekeeper said, his voice dripping with ancient contempt. "The power of the earth, of death itself, it is not meant to be wielded by mortal hands. You are playing with forces beyond your understanding." Mira felt a shiver of fear run through her, but she steeled herself. The Gravekeeper's words were like venom, but she had made her choice. She would not be a slave to the curse. "I don't care," she replied, her voice steady. "I will break free, no matter the cost." The Gravekeeper's laughter filled the room, dark and hollow, and the fog shifted violently. "You cannot break free from what is woven into your very soul, child." Mira's heart pounded in her chest, but she pushed through the growing fear. She could feel something changing inside of her. The energy of the altar, the power that had broken free, was now coursing through her veins, like liquid fire. It burned, searing her flesh, but in the pain there was a strange clarity. The Gravekeeper's form loomed closer, his presence suffocating, and Mira realized she could feel him. His essence, his power was now intertwined with hers. But it wasn't just his power. Something else was emerging. Her power, the blood of the Varos ran deep, and it was awakening. "I will not become you," she whispered fiercely, her eyes blazing with a new fire. The fog swirled violently around her, and for the first time, Mira felt like she could control it. The darkness, the power, it no longer felt like a weight on her shoulders. It felt like an extension of herself. The Gravekeeper's form flickered, as if uncertain. "You think you can control it? You think you can control me?" Mira lifted her hand, and the shadows recoiled. The Gravekeeper's power, which had once been suffocating, now felt weak in her grasp. She could feel it, her blood, her ancestors' blood, rising to meet this challenge. She was no longer simply the victim of the curse. She was the one wielding it. The fog swirled, pulled and pushed against her, as if it were alive. But Mira's will was stronger. The Gravekeeper's presence began to shrink, his form flickering with uncertainty. Mira felt a surge of power in her chest, a raw, untapped strength that had lain dormant for generations. With a scream, she raised both hands, and the fog tore itself apart. The shadows recoiled, as if in fear. The Gravekeeper screamed, his voice laced with fury and disbelief, as his figure began to fade, dissolving into the swirling mist that seemed to answer to her. Mira stood in the center of the church, breathing heavily, her eyes glowing with an unnatural light. The darkness had not consumed her. She had embraced it, harnessed it. She could feel it coursing through her now, powerful, dangerous, and hers to command. For the first time, Mira felt free, but as the fog began to settle, and the oppressive weight of the curse lifted from her shoulders, something else shifted in the air. Mira felt it, an ominous presence, a shadow lingering just beyond her reach, waiting for its moment to strike. It wasn't over, not yet. The fog was thinning, but Mira knew better than to believe it was over. The air was still thick with a charged energy, as if the very fabric of reality had been torn open and was now struggling to heal. Her body trembled from the surge of power coursing through her veins, but she stood tall, defiant. She had made her choice. She had chosen to embrace the curse, to wield the darkness, to become the gravekeeper herself. But as she looked around, something felt wrong, something deeper than the lingering whispers, something far more sinister than the fog that had swallowed the village. There was an ancient primordial force at work here, something that was not merely bound to her bloodline, but was a part of the very land she now stood upon. The church was eerily silent, the twisted remnants of the altar still smoking from the power she had unleashed. The walls of the church groaned, and Mira felt a sudden sharp pain in her chest, a piercing, suffocating pressure that made her gasp for breath. It's not over, she realized, her mind screaming in warning. The gravekeeper isn't gone. Her heart raced as the dark presence, the one that had haunted her every step, began to reappear. The air grew heavier again, more oppressive, as if the very earth beneath her feet was tightening its grip on her. The fog thickened once more, swirling around her like an inescapable storm. But now it wasn't just the fog. Something else was rising from the depths of the ground, something older than the curse, older than death itself. Mira turned toward the altar, now in ruin. The stones that had once held the ancient power of the curse were now fractured, but the air still hummed with their residual energy. There was no escaping what had been set in motion. She could feel it. The gravekeeper wasn't just an entity of death. He was a keeper of something far more ancient, the land itself. The curse was not just a punishment or a fate. It was a tether, a binding that linked her bloodline to the very soul of Roran Vale, and beyond that to the forgotten depths of the earth. Mira's hand flew to her chest, as if trying to claw the pain out of her heart. The pulse of dark energy throbbed there, a constant reminder of the power she had claimed. But now that same power seemed to be twisting inside of her, as if it were turning against her. Then she heard a deep, guttural voice, like the growl of a dying beast, reverberated from the very earth beneath her feet. The gravekeeper's voice, but distorted, far more malevolent. "You think you can defy me?" the voice hissed, echoing from every corner of the room. "You think you can control what was never meant to be controlled? You, child of the Vero bloodline, are nothing but a tool, an instrument to maintain balance. You cannot escape what you are, nor can you ever undo what has been done." Mira's chest heaved as she staggered back, struggling to keep her footing. The shadows around her twisted and writhed like serpents, closing in on her, suffocating her with their malevolent presence. But she refused to give in. "I will not be your puppet," she shouted, her voice breaking the thick silence that had surrounded her. She closed her eyes and focused on the pulse within her, the energy that had surged into her, the power of the curse that had become a part of her, the power of the gravekeeper himself. "I am the gravekeeper now. I control this, not you." The ground beneath her feet shook violently, as if the earth itself were fighting her. The fog churned, forming into shapes, writhing tendrils, shadowy figures that reached out for her. But Mira reached deep inside, feeling the strength of her will, the strength of every generation of her ancestors who had fought against the curse, even if they had ultimately failed. She was not their failure. She was their reckoning. Her eyes glowed with an unearthly light as she lifted her arms. The very air seemed to hum with energy, the fog swirling into chaotic patterns. She drew upon the power of the land itself, the curse entwined in her blood, and began to force the fog back, commanding it with every fiber of her being. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling with power. "This ends now." The gravekeeper's laughter echoed around her, distorted and angry. "You cannot wield this power," his voice bellowed. "You cannot contain it. You will become like me, lost, consumed by the very darkness you seek to control." Mira clenched her fists, her resolve hardening. She could feel the darkness pulling at her, testing her strength. The shadows wrapped around her like chains, whispering promises of ultimate power, of eternal dominion over death. But Mira refused to be tempted. She had already chosen. She would not be consumed. "I choose my fate," she shouted, her voice rising in defiance. The ground trembled again, more violently this time, but she stood firm, her feet planted on the shattered altar. She summoned the energy within her, the ancient power that had been awakened, and for the first time she felt it bend to her will, not the other way around. The fog swirled violently, the shadows recoiling as if in fear. The earth shook as the gravekeeper's voice, now pleading, began to fade into the distance. Mira's heart pounded in her chest, but she didn't fall. She focused all of her energy, every ounce of strength she had left, and forced the darkness back, away from her, away from the village, away from the land that had been cursed for so long. For a moment, everything went still. The fog cleared, the oppressive weight lifted from the air, and Mira stood alone in the center of the church, surrounded by silence. The gravekeeper was gone, the darkness was gone, and Mira felt it, the heavy weight lifting from her chest. The curse was no longer a part of her. She had broken the cycle. But even as she stood there, victorious, a small voice whispered in her mind, a voice that was not her own. "You may have won today, child, but the earth always finds a way to claim its own." Mira's eyes narrowed as she turned toward the door of the church, the sunlight filtering through the broken windows. The land was silent now. For the first time she felt at peace, but deep down she knew that peace was fleeting. The curse had been broken, but the land, Roran Vale, would always remember. It would always thirst for blood. And somewhere, deep beneath the earth, something stirred, waiting. The gravekeeper's grip had been broken, but the land was forever bound to death. Mira looked down at her hands, now shaking from the intensity of the power she had just wielded. She had chosen to break the curse, but at what cost? The weight of the bloodline was gone, and yet something in her heart told her that her journey was far from over.